Free agency has officially begun as NBA players and teams start negotiating, but where does Miami stand? We break down the latest news on Kevin Love's future, Josh Richardson, Thomas Bryant, and more. Plus, what's next for Miami on today's episode of Locked On Heat.
You are Locked On Heat, your daily Miami Heat podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
All right, you are Locked On Heat, your everyday podcast on the Miami Heat, whether you're tuning in on YouTube, Odyssey, or your favorite podcast app. Thanks for making Locked On Heat your first listen every day, Monday to Friday. I'm Wes Goldberg, editor at allyoucanheat.com, here with David Ramil, both of us credentialed Heat media members. Today's episode is brought to you by FanDuel. Make every moment more. As playoffs wind down, the sports stop sporting like we want them to, but this summer, FanDuel is hooking up all customers with a boost or a bonus daily. That's right, there's something there for everybody every day, all summer long. Visit FanDuel.com/lockedon to get started. NBA free agency began about an hour ago, and there really hasn't been that much action. I guess James Harden agreed to a new deal with the Clippers. It looks like Paul George and Klay Thompson are going to eventually change teams. We just got the tweet that Andre Drummond is signing with the 76ers. So there's that, but it feels like everybody's waiting for the bigger dominoes to fall. Paul George, Klay Thompson, and then kind of things fall behind that. But that said, we did get some news from the Heat that Kevin Love is going to re-sign on a 2-year, $8 million deal. No player option, no team option on that second year. So Kevin Love has an opportunity now, under contract, 2 more years with the Heat, can play until he's 37 years old. What do you think of Kevin Love coming back, David?
So no player option on that second year. At least that's what's being reported. Okay.
Right.
Well, we should clarify. He did have an opt-in for his second year of his deal that he signed last year. He signed a 2-year deal last year, played out that one season, obviously the 23-24 season. He had an option for this year, which we thought he'd exercise, but he didn't. He opted out. We found out about this just yesterday, right before the deadline, that he opted out of that last year of his contract, and it was presumably to sign a more team-friendly deal. Then he winds up signing this 2-year deal with no player option. So he wants to stay. He wants to stay in the NBA and with Miami for another 2 years, presumably before he calls it quits. It's and I don't know how to take it, to be honest with you, because one, I think I'm not sure on the surface if it's the right deal for Miami. Like Miami's luxury. Look, Miami's got salary cap situations all over the place. They can't really attract any big names. I love Kevin being on this team and the steadying presence that he brings. He's their backup center, etc. But at the same time, 2 years and not knowing exactly, like, I don't think he's going to have a significant drop off. I just don't know that he's going to be able to really contribute at a high level consistently. Like, he already went through injury this past year. He was kind of unplayable in the playoffs against a really good Boston Celtics team. Is that something that we could expect to see more of in the future? Or is he going to have another bounce back? And for him to sign for 2 years, I'm a little surprised. I found myself a little, again, I thought on the surface, I was like, oh man, Caleb's back. It's great. He's such a positive influence in the locker room. But then when you think about it from just the contract perspective, Miami has so little flexibility. I thought he would take more of a minimum deal.
Well, this is very close.
To what you did.
This is very close to the minimum for a guy with 10 plus years of experience. The only it would have been about $400,000 difference. The minimum for somebody at his age, at his NBA experience, would have been $3.6 million. He signed for essentially what amounts to a $4 million contract. Except what he gave up in the player option, he just basically picked that up and then added a second year on it. I'm surprised that Kevin Love wants to play in the NBA for another 2 years. I thought opt in for that next $4 million, 4 million reasons to not retire, and then retire. Right. And apparently he's ready to play another 2 years. So Kevin Love has said, he told me for a piece I wrote about him on The Ringer a couple years ago when the Heat first got him, that he wants to try to play until he's 40. And so this obviously doesn't get him to 40, but it gets him to 37. And then I think maybe you just, if you're Kevin Love, you kind of figure out what you want to do after that. And then, you reassess at that point. But I think it's a fine deal. I was a little surprised that there was no option at the end. Maybe both sides just said, you know what, let's not even worry about this. You're going to come off the bench. We're not going to ask you to start. You played 15, 16 minutes per game last year as our primary backup center. We just drafted Khalil Ware. You'll be here to show him the ropes. He's a good locker room presence, like you said. Has taken a lot of players under his wing. Jaime Jaquez Jr., right? Nikola Jovic. Like Kevin Love's a
Duncan,
great
yeah.
presence to have Duncan. So having him in that locker room, it's almost he's not Udonis Haslem, but he definitely still plays a role for this team. Not like
Right.
Haslem basically was just a coach in a uniform for the last couple of years, but I think it's good. I think it just makes a lot of sense. Cap wise, it doesn't really impact them a whole lot, right? Like you said, it's not as if that money was going somewhere else. This team was already operating over the tax and things like that. So either you bring Kevin Love at this money, or you don't. You can't really redistribute that money somewhere else. So I like it. I think I'm fine with it. I like the continuity there in the front court rather, and then adding a rookie with Ware, who's now going to have Bam Adebayo to learn from and Kevin Love to learn from. I think it makes a lot of sense.
Can I borrow your tinfoil hat for a minute there?
Let's
And
go.
let
Conspiracy,
loose? Okay.
David.
Yeah. So my thought is, you signed up this year. He loves playing with Jimmy, etc. But this is, as I've said before, I think the all-in year. Like Jimmy can walk next year as a free agent. It's a very likely possibility too if Miami's unwilling to give him this money, and then Caleb agrees to that second year specifically so that he could help bridge the gap between whatever this era is with Jimmy Butler and the next season without Jimmy Butler, and that's why he's on this roster still.
Maybe, right? And Jimmy Butler still has that player option, and Kevin Love and Jimmy Butler get along really well. So maybe Kevin Love is saying, let me see what Jimmy does with this player option, right? Like maybe he opts in and plays out the rest of his contract too, right? Because technically the full length of Jimmy Butler's contract would take him through next year if he does pick up that option in that year. Exactly. And then Kevin Love and Jimmy Butler can kind of, age out together. So yeah, I don't know how much of the Jimmy Butler part. I know you're kind of doing a conspiracy theory thing. I do want to touch on the Jimmy Butler part of this later on in the show. But before we get to all that too, the Heat, Kevin Love is one of their free agents. Haywood Highsmith is also a free agent, and Caleb Martin is also a free agent after he opted out. It looks like, at least for now, that we're going to have to wait on the Haywood Highsmith and Caleb Martin decisions here. Paul George basically has the entire wing market waiting on whatever it is that he's going to do, right? And it might seem a little silly for Haywood Highsmith to have to wait on Paul George, but if Paul George doesn't go to Philadelphia and the Sixers have all this cap space to mess around with, maybe they do allocate something like that to Haywood Highsmith or Caleb Martin or something like that. So everybody's just waiting on Paul George, it looks like, at least for now. Of course, there's a lot of teams out there with the mid-level exception and things like that they can use on Caleb Martin or Haywood Highsmith and stuff, but at least an hour and 12 minutes into the deadline, we have not gotten any news on Highsmith or Caleb Martin. But I think you and I both expect, at least at this point, Caleb Martin is gone, right?
Yeah.
We all, like, him opting out was the only news that didn't need to be broken. Like, everybody knew that. And then he's going to make a lot of money out there on the market. He's probably going to make something over $10 million a year. The Heat can technically sign him to anything because they have his bird rights, but that would take them up over the second apron, or at least potentially take them up over past the second apron, which they're just not going to do. Haywood Highsmith, if you can bring him back for something less, that might be something more sensible for the Heat. I don't think there's any guarantee either of them come back, though.
No, I think that's 100% correct. I'm a little surprised that some of the fans kind of eager to see Caleb's departure. Like, I know he struggled this year, but I've said this pretty consistently too. I think the injury was a big part of it. Maybe that's a conversation if he does wind up, or I should say when he does wind up resigning for another team there. But no, I think they've got to keep their options open. This is an opportunity for both of them to collect a major payday. We've said this all along, that they were both going to opt out, and that I think Caleb was much more likely to sign elsewhere, that maybe they could get Haywood on a much more friendly deal for the team and something that could still satisfy him and give him the kind of payday that he's deserving of and that he's looking for, right, and still keep that stability at home and everything else like that with a young daughter and a family here. So we'll see how it plays out. I think, have you heard anything regarding any number of suitors for either of them? Because I know, like, Philadelphia remains an option, for at least Haywood Highsmith. I think they would love to bring back a guy who was part of their farm system early on before he joined the Miami Heat. I wonder if he could add that kind of veteran depth there as a defender, a 3-and-D kind of guy with Caleb. I've heard some mutterings about Chicago being a possibility, Sacramento. I don't know if they have that money still allocated after they re-signed Malik Monk. Is there any potential destination for those two that you think is a likely one?
I think you hit some of them. I think the Pistons with their cap space, because they love to get long defensive wings who aren't consistent shooters. The Hornets.
Sign them both.
Yeah.
Sign them both.
The Hornets, the Jazz, the Spurs, the Sixers, all those teams I've heard could be sort of in the mix for Haywood Highsmith. So we do know that the Heat and Highsmith have had some conversations during the negotiation window, and teams can negotiate with their own players. Obviously, that didn't turn into what it turned into for Kevin Love, who was able to come to terms with a contract during that window and sign that pretty much immediately as soon as free agency started 6 p.m. on Sunday. It looks like Haywood Highsmith is at least going to go to the open market and test the open market and see what those offers look like compared to whatever it is that he already talked about with the Heat. So we'll see how that plays out. Going forward, what else do the Heat have to do in this free agency? Who opted out? Who opted in? What players do the Heat have under contract? What comes next for the Heat during this free agency period? Plus, what does Jimmy Butler coming back next year mean for the Heat? We'll talk about all of that and more coming up on Locked On Heat.
Today's episode is brought to you by FanDuel. I love sports. You love sports. We love them so much that we're here, and we don't want them to ever stop. But as the playoffs wind down, the playoffs actually have wound down. What are we talking about? We get fewer games, and the sports just aren't sportsing like we want them to. But FanDuel lets you keep the sports going whenever you want, because all you have to do is open the app and dream up the bets anytime you're in the mood. And this summer, FanDuel is hooking up all customers with a boost or a bonus daily. That's right. Every day, there's something for everyone all summer long. So head over to FanDuel.com/lockedon. Start making the most of your summer. FanDuel, the official sports betting partner of Major League Baseball. We'll be right back.
Thanks for making Locked On Heat your first listen every day. Miami Heat talk every day, 5 days a week, even during the offseason. If you're new to us on YouTube, hit that subscribe button. You can also follow us on your favorite podcast app. Let's just do sort of a status check on the Heat's roster. So Kevin Love comes back to your deal, so he's on the roster. Josh Richardson also opted in over the weekend when all these players had that option.
He would, yes.
Most expected he would. So nothing really shocking there. Thomas Bryant opted out. Not all that surprising. I think we expected that to happen, and then especially so after drafting Khalil Ware in the first round. And then Caleb Martin opts out, as we all expected, and he's probably going to leave in free agency because the Heat can't afford him. So that leaves the Heat with Terry Rozier, Josh Richardson, Duncan Robinson, Tyler Hero, Jimmy Butler, Jaime Jaquez Jr., Nikola Jovic, Bam Adebayo, Kevin Love, plus Khalil Ware, Pelle Larsson on the roster. That's 13 players under contract. And Orlando Robinson. I'm sorry, I didn't mention Orlando Robinson, whose contract becomes guaranteed on July 15th. So the Heat kind of have what amounts essentially into a team option on Orlando Robinson, but they have until July 15th to make that decision. They can clear a roster spot by waiving Orlando Robinson, which is why I bring all of that up. But essentially what we're looking at is maybe adding 1 or 2 more players, right? The Heat tend to stick with 14 players instead of 15. They rely a lot on their two-way guys. Zion Pullen, Keshad Johnson, these guys added as undrafted free agents on two-ways. They have extended restricted free agent qualifying offers to Cole Swider and Alondis Williams. So it feels like one of those two guys will compete for their third two-way contract spot.
And not Jamal Cain, by the way.
And not Jamal Cain. So because of Jamal Cain's level of NBA experience, he was not allowed, and because he did 2 years on a two-way, he was not allowed to be tendered a qualifying offer that would be for the two-way contract. It would if the Heat extended a qualifying offer to him to make him a restricted free agent, it would have to be for a standard contract. And the Heat have had opportunities to bump Jamal Cain up to the regular 15-man roster for 2 years now and haven't done it because of whatever reason. They just didn't feel like he was ready for that job. And it looks like Jamal Cain is going to be an unrestricted free agent, not on the Heat next year. So that's essentially where the Heat's roster stands. Where do you want to go with it?
I don't know. I guess area of need, if you're looking at the roster as it currently stands, if you're going to target like a position, like we all assumed that DeLon Wright, he provided a nice boost. And again, there's a familiarity with the franchise because his brother played here and everything else. And he just seemed like a name that had been linked to Miami for some time. We all thought that was kind of a foregone conclusion that they would wind up re-signing him. But between the addition of Pelle Larsson and now these qualifying offers to Alondis, et cetera, who they view as a point guard, is there a need to bring back DeLon Wright? Because I'm not so sure that it is as likely a possibility as that we had once discussed. So it's something to consider. Other than that, like if there's a particular
No, let's say I think that's good, and I wanted to clarify something. I misspoke. I think I said there's 13 players under contract. There's 12 players under contract, and so the Heat will be able to bring in maybe 2 more players on regular roster spots, put that at 14, and then you have the 3 two-way guys. I still think they need to add a point guard. Terry Rozier is the closest thing they have to a traditional point guard on the roster. Josh Richardson dabbled with playing point guard before he got hurt last year. He's not a traditional point guard, even though he can do
No
it.
good.
Pelle
Yeah.
Larson is more of a
No.
wing than a point guard. Even with Alondas Williams, there's no guarantee he's a good NBA player, right? He's on a 2-way contract. Maybe, right? He might not even be back. He's still technically a restricted free agent. He's not under contract. So I think you need to add another traditional point guard. Now, the names that are out there, Chris Paul was waived by the Warriors. They waived his $30 million non-guaranteed contract. Would he sign somewhere at the minimum? Does it feel, it kind of just feels like he's destined to end up with the Lakers or the Clippers? There's a report right now that the Clippers are trying to trade Russell Westbrook. I bet that maybe they could backfill Westbrook with Chris Paul in LA. Yeah, I mean, it's not awesome for the Clippers, but it kind of feels like we're heading in that direction anyway. Chris Paul, maybe. I feel like that bridge is probably burnt in Phoenix, even though there's obviously a need for him there. But
Yeah.
DeLon Wright makes some sense. You could bring him back on the minimum. Maybe that's something. Do they go cheaper? That's the other part of this too. DeLon Wright is how many years of NBA experience? They can go with somebody who's maybe not a rookie, but within their first 3 years of NBA experience, and that minimum contract is cheaper. And this team is a little bit in a payroll bind here, so that's something to consider.
Projected salary cap also lower than what it was expected, right? By like $500,000.
Yeah,
something like that. Yeah, so that extra $400,000 that Kevin Love got, I guess, or sacrifice, that was basically due to the salary cap. So yeah, I think that makes sense. They should bring somebody back. I don't know. Like, this team has operated so frequently as, you know what, we'd rather take our chances on these veteran guys, but at the same time, it could also be like, maybe this is nickel and diming, but they could sign somebody like late in the year as a late season addition too, and it'd be like, oh, a prorated contract, so they could save themselves a significant amount of money too. So that's something that they've done in the past, or they could just wait for a buyout candidate and be like, well, you know what, we'll roll into camp with what we've got, and then we'll just see who gets bought out, and then we can sign somebody later on, because that's just what we've done in the past. I don't know.
They do have to at least sign 2 guys before you get into training camp, just to hit the minimum on the roster, right? Roster. So, I think point guard is a spot. I think there's a reason why they were looking at point guards pretty seriously in the first round before the ones that they liked were off the board by the 15th pick. I think there's a recognition that even if it's not like a young point guard with upside, to get somebody that can play that position would be really important. I wouldn't rule out DeLon Wright. And then, of course, considering that Caleb Martin is probably gone, Haywood Highsmith could be gone, depending on what happens with Highsmith, you're probably going to need another wing or 2 to add to this roster, right? And so you look at who's available there. It was reported that Nick Batum would not be coming back to Philadelphia. So if you can get him on the minimum, then I think that would be a great, like, that to me makes a lot of sense for this team, especially.
I thought I saw a report that he was coming back to Philadelphia. You saw something that indicates that he's kind of parting ways with that?
Kelly Iko said that Nicholas Batum will not re-sign with the Sixers.
Perfect.
I'm looking at that right now. So,
yeah, he'd be great here.
I mean, he'd be great anywhere. That's the great part about Nick Batum. And so, if you're the Heat, going and finding, maybe getting him on the minimum makes some sense. It's a little bit like last year when they also, when they were linked to a guy like Kelly Oubre Jr. and things like that, and Christian Wood and all these players, but they were waiting for the Damian Lillard domino to fall before they made any of those moves. And by the time they figured they got some sort of resolution on the Lillard front, all those guys had signed elsewhere. Well, now, fortunately for the Heat, you kind of know what you're doing, right? Like, Jimmy Butler is not going to be seeking that extension right now. If you want, you can just go into the next season with Jimmy Butler and basically just run this whole thing back, but you need to add some players to the roster. So there is at least some clarity there. So I would expect the Heat to make moves much sooner than basically what they had to deal with last year, where they were kind of in a holding pattern until they figured out the whole Dame situation. But in terms of Jimmy Butler, I think we need to talk about what him deciding not to try to get that extension this summer really means for the Heat, like in the big picture view of things, because it doesn't seem like this is going to be a very active offseason for the Heat right now, considering just there's not that many great free agents. The Heat don't have much cap space and all these things. They're pretty limited in terms of what they can do.
Yep.
Still, obviously, an opportunity to make some trades and do those kinds of things. But what does this look like for the Heat big picture? What does this next season look like? How should they view the whole team building process here in free agency? We'll talk about all of that next year on Locked On Heat. Thanks for making Locked On Heat your first listen every day. Make sure you're subscribed on YouTube. Let us know in the comments section what free agents you think the Heat should go out and sign this summer. Also follow us on your favorite podcast app. Any other available free agents that you wanted to talk about in terms of their fit with the Heat? Even a guy like Cassius CaldwellPope, who would be like a nice addition here. He's going to be too expensive.
Yeah,
We're really looking at veteran guys here.
Yeah. I'm looking at like $20 million, right? That's what I've heard as far as like where KCP might command there.
Yeah,
I mean,
kind of
more than what Caleb
deal. Yeah.
Yeah, it's a tough spot for Miami. Again, and I have to reiterate this because I know right now, if you're stuck with the show for this long, and you might be looking at as free agency is playing out in real time, being frustrated because in years past you've always thought of Miami as a player at free agency, a team that could get involved and try to acquire some of these names. Obviously, last year was a different situation, but there was still some excitement because of the Dame Lillard possibility that felt like it was going to get done. So you were still monitoring this as a Heat fan. You were still monitoring these things closely. I don't know how likely it is that they'll be able to make many changes to this roster. And that's not necessarily a bad thing. You know, I can see that it might get frustration. It might be frustrating, but you know, I was talking to some Heat fans earlier today, and I told them, I said, you know what, they're probably going to run it back, and that's how they view this team. They're trying to set up for something in the future. I don't know how likely that is, but at the same time, they look at this team and they said, you know what, had Jimmy been healthy, had Terry been healthy, they still like their chances of being able to upset some of the competition in the Eastern Conference. And while you can look at the team like Boston or maybe even Philadelphia, if they're able to acquire Paul George or any other, the New York Knicks, etc. Yeah, those would probably seem on paper the three strongest teams in the Eastern Conference. Well, Miami has never played. Oh boy, CaldwellPope in Orlando.
To the Magic. I was letting you kind of get through your thing before I interrupted with the news.
$22 million a year. So yeah, that's why they didn't bring back Joe Ingles. I guess they cleared up some space here. That team is going to be really good defensively because now
the Orlando Magic,
KCP.
They won the division last year. Right? That's the team to beat essentially in the Southeastern Division, if you look at it that way. So the Hawks made their big move. They traded DeJounte Murray to the Pelicans over the weekend. That could go either way in terms of what that means for Trae Young's future. Does that mean they're tearing it all down?
See the odds on Trae Young's next team being Miami? I think that's something worth bringing up.
Let's talk about that because I think the overwhelming odds are this is kind of the team, right? But I do think that the Heat are out there looking. I think they looked very seriously at the Mikal Bridges thing. And obviously that did not work out. But I think that this is not a team that's just saying, hey, we're good running it back. We think that we're a championship team as constructed, that we don't need to improve anything. No. That's not how this front office operates. Although that is obviously a possibility that you just end up with, like you said, it's really hard to pull off these trades, especially now in this second apron world where it's not just the Heat that are limited by stuff. Like all these teams are limited by something, right?
Right.
And if you just take back more money in a trade, it essentially hard caps you. For a lot of these teams, it's going to be really difficult for some of these deals to get done. But deals will happen, and smart front offices like Miami's will figure it out. And right now, with the way their cap books are, again, not they still need to sign some more players, but they're $6.5 million away from becoming a non-tax team.
Right.
And I think that if you're the Heat, you could say, you know what? If that big move isn't out there, if we're not able to trade for a Trae Young or a Donovan Mitchell or whatever this stuff is,
right?
Does it behoove us to maybe clean up our books a little bit? Maybe we spend the summer, instead of making that big going after that whale, just clean up the books so that we can be a little bit more, flexible going forward to try to go get those players. And I don't know that they'll go so far as to go with a salary dump where you're going to just call up the Hornets or the Pistons, these teams, the Jazz, these teams with all the cap space, and say, here's Terry Rozier, Duncan Robinson, or Tyler Hero's contract, and we're trying to save some cap space. But you could do a deal that brings you another player on a smaller contract, and could still maybe it wouldn't be a total salary dump where you're taking a huge step back, but maybe a marginal step back, a worse player, but still a helpful one who's making $10 or more million less than the player you're sending out. And
Right.
that would really help Miami's books. And maybe you can get a draft pick or something like that in return, and you can kind of add to your base there in terms of your draft capital that you're able to send out. I think that the Heat could look into that this summer, depending on how things shake out and what some of these other teams might need after some of these free agents sign and stuff like that. I think that's totally on the table.
Yeah. It's definitely a possibility. Should we rehash the Jimmy Butler
Yeah.
choice there and what that means for Miami?
Well, the other version of this too, right, is just because Jimmy Butler isn't going to seek a trade or a new contract this summer doesn't mean that the Heat don't have to trade him, right? I mean, there's this idea here that I know that Jimmy Butler wants to be here, and I do think that the Heat want Jimmy Butler there next season. I don't think that he's on the trade block, but generally speaking, NBA teams don't like losing their star players for nothing.
Right.
And that's essentially if Jimmy Butler does what he says he's going to do, which is play next year and then revisit the contract next year, probably by opting out of his player option, then yeah, the risk is that he can walk away for nothing. And maybe that ends up being good for the Heat because Jimmy Butler will be past his prime, and then
Right.
you get off the salary and all that stuff, but you'll still be losing your star player for nothing. And you still won't have a whole lot in terms of draft picks and all these things that you could do. Whereas if you were to trade Jimmy Butler, you can get a lot of stuff back for him, presumably. I don't think Jimmy Butler's on the trade block, but what if the Warriors or a team like that that's desperate overwhelms Miami with an offer? You'd have to at least listen to it, right?
Yeah, I don't see why not. I mean, even Philadelphia, right? Like, assuming they whiff on Paul George or whatever. I mean,
Right.
is that still a possibility for them to try and pursue Jimmy Butler? Like,
I think
we have to
so.
think of it from their perspective. Yeah, I think they'd want
Even
to
though it looks like we're going into a
maximize.
direction where they're going to get Paul George, but still, to your point, yeah.
Yeah. So, I mean, you'd have to take those offers. You have to at least listen because, well, you might still look at this year and see we have enough, and you want to go all in on this possible season and bring this team back for yet another year. Other teams might be closer to bringing a title home.
Well, what was that report that the Warriors offered something for Zach LaVine? It was Andrew Wiggins. I'm looking at it right now. It was Andrew Wiggins and Chris Paul for Zach LaVine. Is that something that if the Warriors were to offer that to the Miami Heat for Jimmy Butler, I mean, they can't do the Chris Paul part of it anymore because they waived him. But Andrew Wiggins with some other things for Jimmy Butler, I don't know that that's sort of that doesn't qualify to me as the overwhelming thing, right? I think that Andrew Wiggins' salary, that contract has negative value across the league. Now, if the Warriors were to throw in a Jonathan Kuminga or a Brandon Podziemski or a Moses Moody or a bunch of draft picks or whatever, I still don't know that that's overwhelming enough for Miami to move off their star player, but it could be enough for them to at least listen to the offer. Maybe they can get into some sort of negotiations with Golden State. I don't know, but it's hard. The same thing that Warriors fans are talking about right now too is we don't have enough stuff to go get the star. It's very similar to what Heat fans are talking about in terms of we don't have enough stuff to go get that star. I don't know. I really don't know what would be out there. It would be a pretty desperate attempt with an all-in kind of chips on the table move by another team. But let's talk a little about Zach LaVine because there's reporting there too that the Bulls are just trying. They'd be willing to maybe include a first-round pick to get off that contract. Like, is that something that the Heat should think about?
I don't see how they can entertain that notion considering how much money he's due
Yeah,
over the next couple of years of his contract. Like, that's the problem with Levine. More than the talent, it's the possibility of him just having to pay him so much money. And regardless of how you perceive his value, he does not meet the same kind of, he doesn't have the same value
right.
contractually based on his production. So I don't think it's a good deal for
For
Miami to pursue at all.
$47 million a year this coming year. He's still under contract for 3 years. In today's CBA, you basically get 2 max level players and then that's it. And then you're basically building around $20 million players and less. And the Heat are kind of in that spot right now, although Tyler Hero is making almost $30 million a year. Terry Rozier is more 24, 25 million a year. That's why I'm saying like maybe they're able to kind of take one of those salaries and save some money and still get maybe a helpful player back. I think that that's something that they could explore. But if you're a team acquiring Zach LaVine, it has nothing to do with whether or not Zach LaVine would make this team better or any team better. The reason the Bulls are having such a hard time shopping Zach LaVine, getting off this contract, is every team is basically operating as in, We get 2 max guys. That's it. In this new second apron world, we don't want one of them to be Zach LaVine because of his injury history and because, yes, he's a good player, but he's not a max level all NBA type player. If you're paying the max salary, that player better be performing at a max level. And Zach LaVine just doesn't. And so I think that's why all these teams across the league are saying, we like Zach LaVine fine, but we don't want to pay him that much money because that means it's him and one other max player, and we don't think that gets us very far, and it's not worth the salary. So I'm with you. I don't think that that's something that they should seriously look at. It would be pretty surprising if they did, considering that they already have Jimmy and Bam under contract to make Zach LaVine a third max player in today's CBA, and what that would mean going forward would be pretty tough financially. All right. So that's pretty much it. We're about an hour and a half into free agency. The Cassius CaldwellPope news just came down. So stuff is starting to happen there. We'll see what ends up happening on Miami's front in terms of Caleb Martin, Haywood Highsmith. Are they able to make any other moves? But that's sort of where we're at as free agency begins here for the Miami Heat and for the rest of the NBA. But for now, that'll do it
as
for
expected.
Us. Oh, as expected. No surprises. Good point. No surprises yet. But it's the NBA. And there's always surprises somewhere at some point, right? Thanks for making Locked On Heat your first listen every day. Like, comment, subscribe on YouTube, and follow us on your favorite podcast app.